Hello, good afternoon, good morning. Nice to see all these people joining in. And give ourselves a couple more minutes just to see if anyone else is going to come in and join us today. All right, we might just wait one more minute just to see if anyone else is going to join us today, and then we can get started. All righty. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world today, and welcome to this webinar on which brands won the Super Bowl. So in today's session, we'll be discussing a case study that myself and the team recently conducted on a topic that's very close to my own heart, advertising at the Super Bowl. Specifically, Veylinx set out with this case study to study the impact of advertising on consumer demand, ultimately with a view to helping brands improve their advertising and communication strategy. And a quick note to say before we begin, that we'll be happy to share the slides from today, the recording of this presentation, as well as my notes, which contain some of the finer details. And I should also say there'll be some time for a short Q&A session at the end of this presentation. So please don't hesitate to drop in any questions into the chat, or feel free to save them until the end. So for those who don't know me, and I'm sure that's at least a couple of you, my name is Clark, and I'm a senior insights consultant here at Veylinx. On the agenda for today is a quick overview of our case study, how it was conducted, and how it differs to traditional research, and a bit of a spoiler that at Veylinx we do things a little differently here. Second, we'll walk through the results with a specific focus on how advertising at the Super Bowl impacted consumer demand for some very important and interesting brands. And finally, we'll provide a recap of the conclusions of the study, as well as some advice and some key takeaways. So before we get started, I should mention, like I have already, that at Veylinx we do things a little differently. Traditional survey methods measure verbal intention without action, meaning there's a huge gulf between what people say they will do and what they'll actually do. And this gap between talk and action is called the hypothetical bias in academic terms, and it can really dramatically distort results, especially in online research settings. And we know this can be as much as 500%. There's a big gap between claiming that someone will buy a product and actually buying one. And we at Veylinx use quite a unique behavioral methodology to gather consumer insights that are faster, leaner, and more accurate than in traditional research. Using our auction-based platform, consumers have skin in the game in the research, meaning that we can measure their true purchase behavior instead of their claimed purchase intent. And so how do we do this? Well, this unique methodology works as such. Consumers are told to place a single bid on each product they're exposed to. So in this case, a Michelob Ultra, and they're asked to give us the maximum they would be willing to pay for this particular product. Consumers can place a positive bid if they want to. So for example, $20, $30, $40 on this Michelob Ultra, or a bid of $0 if they're not interested in the product. And we really encourage people, if they're not interested in the product, to bid $0. And this is followed by a short questionnaire to understand their motives and attitudes towards the product. If their bid is above the selling price, then they win the auction. And if they win an auction on a product that's actually available, consumers are required to pay and will receive the product for real. So we genuinely send them the product and take care of the transaction. But importantly, consumers don't know whether they're evaluating a product that will actually lead to a transaction. And this means that consumers are exposed to the same risk of purchase, regardless of whether they're evaluating a real product or just a concept or an idea. So they're always exposed to that same risk of purchase. So now that we've covered the methodology, we can dive into the case study itself. And of course, it's quite a compelling topic. Super Bowl has been traditionally considered the pinnacle of television advertising, but in recent years, many brands have questioned, and perhaps rightly, the necessity of spending millions of dollars on a single commercial spot. And it's clearly a pretty hot topic in the media. As you can see here, publications from Entrepreneur to Ad Age to Food Navigator have covered our findings. It's a very hot topic in the industry. So how did we tackle this one? Well, our study involved recruiting over 1,600 participants, and it was conducted in 2 phases. In the first phase, we developed a baseline of consumer demand before the advertising campaigns began, well before the Super Bowl was a hot topic in the minds of consumers too. And this was followed by a second wave where we checked back after the Super Bowl weekend to see whether demand had changed, and importantly, for which products and among which demographic factors. So the key metric for this research is demand, and this comes from our behavioral methodology. Specifically, we were looking at demand at the current retail price. So let's say $12.97, for instance, in case of Michelob Ultra. And this data comes from the auction, as I said, and we really analyze how much consumers are willing to pay to understand the kinds of demand we can expect for particular products. And when we talk about demand at a given price point, we're talking about the share of consumers who would be willing to pay that price. So if we consider, for example, demand at $20, this is the share of consumers who bid at least $20. Or put another way, if we offered them a big box of Michelob Ultra for $20, this would be the share of consumers who would actually buy it. So specifically, in terms of the research design, consumers entered our screener to make sure that we were speaking to the right people. And importantly, we wanted to understand whether they were intending to watch the Super Bowl at all. And this was followed by the auction, where we displayed the product and asked them what's the maximum they would be willing to pay using our Nobel Prize winning approach of the Vickery auction. And then we had a few profiling questions as well. So we wanted to understand how familiar consumers were with each of the brands that we studied, and a couple of different follow-up questions as well. And then, as I said before, we repeated the whole process after the Super Bowl weekend to understand which products had changed in terms of consumer demand and among which different demographics. The study covered a wide variety of different categories. We can see that overleaf. And this was to ensure that we could capture any divergence in the results. So we can see here a list of the different brands that we studied. And these included across categories like alcoholic and non-alcoholic beer, sauces, laundry fresheners, liquor, salty snacks, and carbonated soft drinks or sodas. And you can see on the right-hand side here, so that we could further contextualize the results, we also included a non-advertiser benchmark for each advertiser that we studied. And this was in order to check if there was any halo effect from advertising at the Super Bowl, really trying to help us ground our understanding of how consumer demand was changing before and after the Super Bowl itself. So next up, the results. So our research showed that overall, the advertising campaigns conducted for the Super Bowl did indeed drive higher consumer demand. So there was some kind of advertising impact. And we were able to conclude this, like I said before, by comparing consumer demand at the current retail price before and importantly, after the Super Bowl weekend. And of course, we have a headline stat, which is great. The median rise in consumer demand among advertisers was 6.4%, confirming that Super Bowl commercials can indeed be effective in driving consumer demand for brands. We also study changes in consumers' appetite to spend money on the product at all. So if you can recall, we asked consumers to place a bid that reflects the maximum they would be willing to pay for a product. And through this analysis, we can also determine what's a share of consumers who are willing to risk at least some of their own money. And we do this through a metric called positive bids. And this is the share of consumers who risked at least some of their own money to purchase one of the products. In our case, we saw just over half of consumers expressing some interest in these brands before the Super Bowl weekend, which averaged to about 56%. And this translated into a pretty similar result as well, a median uplift in positive bids of 6.6%. So in both cases, we saw that there was just more activity from the advertisers after the Super Bowl weekend, underscoring the fact that Super Bowl commercials can indeed be an effective tool. And of course, as with any study, there were plenty of nuances in the data. So beer was a clear winner in terms of demand uplift, with Michelob Ultra recording the highest jump at 18.6%, rounded to 19 here. Michelob Ultra also recorded the strongest rise in awareness too. It had 9% higher aided awareness after the Super Bowl weekend, and it was one of the few established super brands that we analyzed that received such a bump. We also saw an interesting story from Pepsi Zero Sugar. So while it generated lower consumer demand than its competitor Coke Zero, which you may be familiar with, during its baseline reading, it was able to drive 17.6% higher demand after the Super Bowl, closing much of the gap between the two products. And finally, number 3, Frito-Lay Popcorners, which is another PepsiCo-owned brand, also appeared to do very well, with nearly 12% higher demand when we ran our second wave after the Super Bowl weekend. It's also worth noting that the effectiveness of these commercials varied greatly based on demographic factors. So while there were differences between the products, of course, like we saw earlier, the ads themselves tended to outperform among women after the Super Bowl weekend. And this was particularly true for beverages. So for Pepsi Zero Sugar, we recorded a 45% increase in demand. For Michelob Ultra, we saw a 40% improvement in demand. And this was also the same for Heineken 0.0%, their non-alcoholic beer, which recorded a 40% increase. And for Crown Royal whiskey, women saw a 26% increase in demand. And all told, that added up to 21% increase across the different products. So for both alcoholic and non-alcoholic version, demand for beer in particular grew from a low base among women. And that was a key reason why Michelob Ultra rose in the rankings. For men, many of the products remained flat or slightly positive after the Super Bowl weekend. And this was particularly true for beer, which is something that could be attributed to broader category awareness pre-game or for other factors. On the flip side, Gen Z viewers were largely unimpressed by the Super Bowl ads, and we can see that here, with demand among 18 to 25-year-olds actually shrinking 1% overall. This could be attributed, and I am, of course, just hypothesizing here, to changing entertainment preferences, or perhaps the media mix of Super Bowl advertising plans, which play heavily on live television, or perhaps some general skepticism towards brand advertising, which is something we've noticed in other research. Interestingly, our research also showed that brands that didn't advertise during the Super Bowl also received higher demand, with a median 4.2% higher after the Super Bowl weekend. And this could be due to a variety of different factors, but some of these could include a potential halo effect of elevated category awareness, which is something that we've seen in other research. Or it could be due to misattribution of the brand, which is, again, sadly, something we see all too often. And it's also possible that non-advertisers deployed some other marketing efforts that we weren't aware of to offset or to take advantage of the Super Bowl buzz and excitement to really leverage that moment. In terms of the non-advertisers who benefited specifically, we saw that Lay's Stacks was able to drive 32% higher demand after the Super Bowl weekend. We saw Corona Extra experienced an uptick of 19% higher consumer demand. And also for Kraft Mayo, we saw 11% higher demand at its regular retail price compared to its baseline. And of course, some brands like Pepsi Zero Sugar, which we already talked about, enjoyed already very wide and mainstream adoption before the Super Bowl. And so use that buzz and excitement surrounding the brand to drive even more impact. And a helpful way to visualize this is as you'll see on the screen, by plotting the rankings of each product we studied across 2 dimensions. The first is the initial demand for the product at its current retail price. And the second is the change in that metric, the change in demand at recommended retail price after the Super Bowl weekend. And here we've plotted a few different examples, like you can see. But this kind of ranking and quadrant analysis can be really helpful in researching things like innovation tracking. So by plotting our different data points here, and we could go for instance, a full suite of products under a single brand, or the range of brands owned by a single company, or perhaps even mapping even a whole category of different products, we can gather some really interesting insights about the relative position of each of our brands that we studied and identify growth opportunities too. Another interesting exercise that we were able to conduct was to compare the results from the USA Today ad meter with the transaction data we generated in our research. And you know, these are 2 different methodologies, of course. Ours is relying on true behavior, while USA Today had a slightly different take. So the ad meter panelists were tasked with voting on all 51 commercials from Super Bowl Sunday and rated them on a scale from 1 to 10 based on likability of the ad. And the results were then averaged to create a final score across the panelists. And as we know from earlier on in this particular presentation, there's a big gap between what people say they will do and what they'll actually do. And perhaps there's an even bigger one when it comes to evaluating the likability of an ad and actually making a purchase. However, when we did run the comparison, we did see a moderate correlation between the rise in consumer demand and the likability of individual ads by ranking. So for example, our winners here, Michelob Ultra, Pepsi Zero Sugar, and Frito-Lay Popcorners all recorded elevated scores on ad likability relative to their specific midpoint. And meanwhile, advertisers that saw flat or even negative results in our case study, so that is Pringles, Downy Unstoppables, and Crown Royal, recorded slightly lower scores in their ad meter. So wrapping up our findings for today, number 1, we did see that advertisers enjoyed a boost in consumer demand after the Super Bowl weekend, and that drove 6.4% higher consumer demand overall when we look at it from a median perspective. Number 2, non-advertisers appear to have enjoyed a bump too, with 4.2% higher demand. Potential reasons for this could be elevated category awareness, misattribution of the brand, or other marketing efforts to offset or perhaps to take advantage of the buzz and excitement around Super Bowl. Number 3, interestingly, we saw women had a much stronger uplift. And this was particularly the case with beer brands we studied, and the fact that demand was growing from a low base. Meanwhile, men recorded mostly flat scores pre and post Super Bowl. Interestingly, Gen Z's demand actually declined by 1%, which may point to switching entertainment preferences and a general skepticism towards advertising. And finally, when we did have a look at the relationships between ad likability and consumer demand, we did see some correlations, some moderate ones. So knowing what we know now, here are a couple of learnings we can take from this particular case study. First, we should determine which ads actually drive consumer behavioral change. 2, and it's an obvious one, but it's essential to optimize ads to drive real impact by testing them prior to launch. 3rd, we should identify and nurture the real target audience for our ads based on behavior and not just claimed purchase intent. and identify which growth areas we're seeking to tap into. 4, we should measure the impact of our marketing campaigns and activities based on true purchase behavior after they've gone live. And helpfully, these are all things that Veylinx can assist brands with. Veylinx can drive changes in innovation and communication strategy. And so if you're looking to improve impact and drive higher consumer demand, I'd very much welcome you to get in touch with myself or a member of our sales team for more information. And I'd love to take any questions you have for us. Any questions from the group on anything that I've just gone over? I'd be more than happy to assist. Okay, I've just seen that we have a couple of questions. So this one, did this study find changes in the price that consumers were willing to pay for the products? It's a very good question. So actually, here at Veylinx, we spend a lot of our time thinking about demand and prices, and we want to try and make sure that innovations are as successful as possible. And part of that is one of the 4 Ps of marketing, which is price. And that's something that we're very adept at looking into. So when we analyze the results of the Super Bowl case study before and after the Super Bowl took place, we can see that there were some changes to how pricing could be influenced based on the results. In a particular case, we saw that it was Michelob Ultra that actually enjoyed an increase in its revenue maximizing price before versus after the Super Bowl. And I'm just bringing up the exact figure now, but we could see that the optimal price for Michelob Ultra was at $12 before the Super Bowl, and that actually rose to $14 post Super Bowl, indicating that there was more premium pricing potential that consumers saw in the product after the Super Bowl. So that was an increase of 17% relative to the first wave. And there were also some other changes as well. We saw that, for instance, the Frito-Lay popcorners had a similar increase in terms of its optimal pricing. So its optimal price shifted from $6 to $7 after the Super Bowl. So not only were there more consumers willing to pay for the product at its regular retail price, we also saw that this meant that there were more shifts in terms of the optimal price to maximize for revenue. And next up, what is the advantage of using this type of data instead of retail sales figures to measure changes in demand? It's an excellent question as well. I think the upside of using this kind of research relative to sales figures is really unpacking the why behind changes in retail sales figures. So we can see, of course, that changes in our units sold per store per week or distribution may be due to different fluctuations in terms of the retail sales operations of our customers. It could be down to different changes in consumer behavior too. But what the changes in unit sales and distribution can't tell us is the why behind these changes. So using a behavioral approach like we do at Veylinx, we can not only capture the true behavior for consumers, but we can also dig into the why. And I think more importantly, we can also understand the value that consumers see in these kinds of products. So by not revealing the price, we can really truly understand how consumers value these particular products. And an upside, like we said before, is that we can also deep dive into pricing as well. So we can really understand the value that consumers see in this product, and therefore we can maximize our pricing strategy to go after the value that consumers see in these products. We have another question here. What was the biggest surprise for you in this research? I think one of the surprising findings for me was the uptick in terms of consumer demand that women had for both alcoholic and non-alcoholic beer. And admittedly, it was growing from a low base, but I think the results really were quite clear and consistent in terms of the uptick in consumer demand for beer products, which I think was a rather interesting finding for me, but not necessarily, not necessarily one that I had anticipated. We also have a question around Rihanna's performance at the Super Bowl. I think certainly there was a lot of hype and excitement about her appearance at the Super Bowl, and it's possible, plausible, that this could have resulted in more females being engaged in this kind of entertainment, and therefore being more likely to have experienced some of these ads, and therefore having some kind of impact in terms of demand. So I certainly think that's a plausible explanation for increased demand among females. And then we also have a question: is it possible to measure an ad campaign's effectiveness before it goes live? Absolutely. So and this is something that we have quite a lot of experience with, by playing an ad before we introduce consumers to a product and allow them to actually purchase the product for real, we can understand the kinds of impact an ad will have in terms of the value that they see in products. So by playing, for instance, 3 different ads before an auction for the same product, we can really arrive at a conclusion as to whether any of the ads, and if so, which ad to prioritize in terms of being able to drive consumer demand for the product. Any other questions for me today? Well, I'd love to thank everyone for your attention. And I'd like to also remind you that we'll be able to share after this session the slides from today, the recordings of this presentation, and of course my notes as well with some of the finer details. And I'd love, if you have any further questions that I didn't touch on today, please don't hesitate to contact me, or your dedicated account manager would be more than happy to chat through the results and also share any further information about how Veylinx can empower changes to innovation and communication strategies to drive real impact with consumers. And lastly, I'd love to thank all of you today for your attendance and your questions. And I really hope that you found this webinar informative. So thank you.